Hello, and welcome to Stories Across Borders. Here we discuss stories told across a range of different mediums, books, movies, games, you name it. The only rule is that we can only discuss these stories in terms of their writing. Something that, once again, I'm realizing I should have told my guest in advance. Anything like acting, animation, art, etc. is off limits unless it relates directly to how the story is being told. I'm Daniel Radford, author, recently deceased, and also your host. And today I'm joined by a new guest on SAB, Eva Langston, who is herself an author and podcast host.
Yes, welcome, or thanks for having me. And I guess you're welcoming me, but thanks for having me. And I did know the rule, so don't worry.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You've actually listened before.
Yes. Um, and I am coming to you from my haunted house built in 1890. When we moved in, we were told that someone had died in the kitchen, and I found some weird things when we first moved in, but since then haven't really heard anything from this
Wow.
ghost. So.
How's that for authenticity?
Except I will tell you that my kids have said some creepy things. When she was two, my 2-year-old, my younger daughter was like, we were in the kitchen and I was about to sit down and she was like, Mommy, don't sit there. Someone else is sitting there. And I looked and there was no one in the chair. So I kind of have this feeling that like kids, they're like minds are more open to things that adults' minds might be, helping us not to see. And I'm like, I don't know. Maybe she saw the kitchen ghost. So
Perhaps. I'm a bit more of a skeptic myself, but who knows? Um,
I don't think I've ever seen a ghost, but I'm open to it. I'm open to the idea that they could be out there. So that's where
that's
I am.
entirely fair. We appreciate ghost agnosticism.
Yes.
Uh, in case it wasn't obvious by that introduction there, audience, today we're going to be discussing one of the oldest story premises there is, one that has taken many forms and spread across many different formats and genres, which is, of course, ghost stories.
Yes, and I will say, as a little introduction to myself, I am also an author, and a writing instructor, and I have written some ghost stories. Nothing too spooky, but I always have, I like to add a little paranormal into a lot of my stories.
Yeah, I mean, I enjoy a good ghost story myself, so it's always good to hear that there are other fans out there. I suppose before we do get too deep into the just going into the weeds of ghost stories and fanning out about it, might be a good idea to just briefly touch on what a ghost actually is conceptually, which I feel like I can feel the collective groans from the audience right now because of course everyone knows what a ghost is, but it never really hurts to go into the specifics.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Tell me, well, what are some of your thoughts about ghosts?
Well,
What a ghost is?
I mean, we all know the general gist. A ghost is, the spirit or soul of a dead being, usually people, sometimes animals. But where it gets interesting is the different stories, cultures, belief systems. There's all these different versions of what they like, why ghosts stick around and how they happen.
Yes.
How they look and act depend varies a lot depending on the lore or the folklore or the mythology.
Yeah, I think you know, a lot of people have kind of the set rules of like, oh, well, a ghost can't pick something up, or they're kind of like this they don't have a physical form, but then I think there are other, if you think about like a poltergeist that can like move objects, or you do see in films sometimes the ghost like learning how to manipulate physical objects. And so I think the rules for like what a ghost can look like and do can be different depending on different stories, different cultures, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, they're usually some degree of incorporeal with varying degrees of discernible figure, ranging from invisible entity to cloud of mist to fully formed intangible being and
Right.
everything possibly in between. And just like you said, how much they can interact with the world is also
Right.
highly dependent on not just the form they take, but also the setting and the mythology and the lore behind this particular depiction of the ghost. which is interesting because it means as a writer you can do a lot with them because they can kind of be whatever you need them to be in the story.
Yeah, I was thinking about, why do I like to write stories with ghost elements? And I think part of it is because you can kind of make up the rules for what suits your story, or it adds this mysterious element of like, well, we don't know exactly what the deal is with this ghost. And yeah, they don't necessarily have to follow all the rules of the physical world, which can be fun.
Yeah,
So I was also thinking too, there's, the amount that the ghost is aware, I think can depend because there are sometimes those ghosts that are like more like echoes of a thing that happened. So it's like, oh, I mean, sort of the headless horseman is an example. He always rides the same route, and then, disappears at the bridge because that's where he was killed. And he's more just kind of like an echo of an event and not so much an actual, I don't know, being that
sentient,
is
like
sentient.
thinking,
Yeah.
reactive. It's doesn't change what it's set part. Yeah, it's interesting. It's in some stories there's a really fine line between a ghost and a memory,
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
or
It's,
you could almost. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
it's sort of the past coming back in one form or another. And yeah, well, go ahead. What were you gonna say?
I was gonna say, which I just think is really interesting. That in a lot of ways, it's just memory made manifest. It's a sort of fun way of doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. That makes a lot of sense. So yeah, so I don't know. Did we explain what a ghost is? I mean, it's a dead person, soul or animal, as you said. I was thinking too about like, can you um can you call it a ghost story if so I was thinking about The Lovely Bones. I don't know if you ever read that book or
It's
saw the
on my
movie.
list of things to touch on, even
Yeah,
in
and
this
it's like, well,
episode.
she's not coming down to earth, but she is sort of like looking at, she's watching from some other realm of what's happening. So does that count as a ghost, or do they have to, actually be on Earth to be counted as a ghost? I don't know.
Well, in my list here of examples of ghost media, I've got the Lovely Bones written down, so I'm counting it.
Okay. Yeah, me too.
Whether or not I should is up for debate, I suppose. But I mean that's one of the things as well that generally speaking, ghosts are known to haunt people or locations. But other than other than the intrinsic link to an afterlife of sorts in whatever world setting ethos they're a part of, there's a lot of different reasons why a ghost can hang around to the extent they can hang around,
Hmm.
and things like that. Most of the time they're depicted as haunting locations or people that are relevant to them in some way.
Right, right. Yeah, that's another one of those kind of quote unquote rules is like, they're yeah, connected to an object or a location and can only, stay in a certain area or yeah, but again, when you're writing the ghost story, it's like you can make up some of those rules, I think.
Yeah, a couple just to rattle off, I suppose a couple of like other sort of common things you can get is generally speaking, you often get some sort of relation to an unnatural or untimely death leading to a ghost comes up a lot,
Hmm.
which makes sense because it very much ties into the other very pervading common thing that I think most ghost stories have this in some way, like going right back to like early historical ghost stories even, in that they tend to have some sort of unfinished business with the world. Uh, you know,
Right.
whether that's vengeance, a regret, just a commitment they feel they have to uphold. It comes up a lot.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's why it's such a huge, part of so many cultures is it is this like almost like a wish fulfillment. We're like, well, okay, it's okay because if our loved one dies or if we die, we can still come back and if we have unfinished business and it's like we really hope in some, I mean, ghost stories can be very scary, but in another way, it's like sort of something we want to have happen. Like, oh yeah, we could come back if we needed to, you know.
Yeah,
So I think that's one of the reasons why they're so popular.
that makes a lot of sense and is maybe, you're very good at this because you keep ticking things off that are on my list for later in the episode.
Oh no, sorry.
That's fine. We'll probably come back around to it anyway. We typically go full circle 3 times over in these episodes. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, we're known to just spiral off as writers, especially are known to do when we get into a topic. But yeah, I mean, there is a lot of variation to ghost stories. Interestingly enough, actually, I when I was doing my research for this episode, I learned that in sort of some more ancient beliefs, rather than a traditional afterlife, the idea is that a ghost is something that just naturally lingers on after death, sort of like an ancestral spirit kind of deal. And they remain attached to Earth and they just don't disappear until they're forgotten, which is kind of the true death, which is kind of interesting.
Oh, I like that. Yeah, that makes a lot of
Which
sense.
is just another one of those thematic links between the idea of ghost and memory, which is very neat in my mind.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's cool. I like that.
But talking about different types of ghosts, how varied they are in their representations and things like that, I think going forward, it would be a good idea to actually look into the sort of common subgenres, I guess. Not really genres, because ghost story is something that transcends genres specifically, but categories, I suppose, of ghost story, because you've got a few sort of common archetypes of ghost story with a bunch of subvariants beyond that that sort of pop up.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think when I was looking into it, I was like, oh, there's really ghost stories in every genre, right? But there are kind of those certain tropes that are always coming up. Yeah.
Yeah, there's surprisingly many because of course the primary thing we think about with ghost stories is horror.
hmm
And I think that's probably a good starting point to get into because the reason ghost stories are often horror, I feel like, is pretty obvious. It's because death is scary and the things associated with death just lend themselves well to horror.
Right, right. Yeah. And I think, it's horror and it's also kind of that more psychological horror where it's not just like a slasher movie. It's like part of the horror is in, the person's own mind. Like I'm thinking, The Haunting of Hill House or, something like that where they're kind of, we're seeing all these scary things, but also the scary thing is happening in the person's own mind as well, you know.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
for sure. I mean, that's exactly right. That one of the things that got wow, I'm doing very well on the words front today, this episode. Ghost stories do make for great horror stories because, in part, whilst they can definitely include the sort of slasher, killer, mundane kind of horror element to it, they aren't bound by the rules of our physics and reality. So they have a much bigger arsenal of ways to torment and harm their victims, both physically and
yes.
psychologically.
I was thinking about, things that you often see and one of them is like you're not even safe in your dreams, right? Because like the ghosts can haunt your dreams, they can there's no place to hide from them because they can even be inside of your own mind kind of thing. So in some ways, I feel like I always get much more scared of ghost stories than I do of just straight like psycho killer because the psycho killer they have limitations whereas a ghost might not have those certain
It's
limitations.
interesting. I actually tend to go more the other direction, I think, in finding.
Really?
Yeah, well, because other horror stories are generally more grounded in realism. They're things that can actually happen to you. I think that adds legitimacy to the horror a lot of the times, which is not to say that ghost stories can't be scary or that I don't like ghost stories, because I very much do. But when I think of things that unnerve me, like that I would find personally concerning, I'm like, I find the idea of an ordinary killer hiding in the dark in a safe place a lot more scary than the idea of a ghost because one of them is a lot more rooted in reality as something that could actually happen to somebody.
Yeah. I wonder, that must say something about our personalities because I definitely get more scared of ghosts and I'll like have to tell myself I haven't been getting as scared of ghosts lately, but talk to me like in the middle of the night after I've just finished reading something spooky and I will say something different. But yeah, I have to remind myself like, okay, even if there's a ghost in the house, it's probably not going to hurt me. It's probably just, doing its thing. Like,
It's right.
I
I'm tempting
definitely
fate
get.
recording this in the middle of the night, so
Oh, yeah, that's true. I can sit here laughing right now because it's daytime out. But anyway. Yeah, that's interesting. I think that I wonder if that's like something you can ask that sort of like sheds light on people's personalities. Is like, what do you find more frightening? You know, a ghost story, horror, or murder, normal psycho killer
I mean,
horror? I don't know.
I feel like it doesn't necessarily have to say anything about a person, but it definitely could.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, some of it also just can be chalked up to the sort of things that scare you, right? The one of
Mm,
the things that
hmm.
makes ghosts scary is the fact that they can take so many different forms and that they can psychologically mess with you so easily, as well as just stabbing you. Um,
Right, right.
because ghost stories have have an advantage almost in that they can lean really heavily into atmosphere, making the familiar dark and spooky and the safe unsafe, which is something that is which is why I get it, I suppose,
Right.
because people don't have the ability, generally speaking, to be that insidious.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and maybe too, it's that so often in ghost stories, it's like the person is kind of questioning their own sanity, and that's really scary. Like, is this something that's really there, or am I just going crazy? And a lot of times, the other people don't believe them, and so maybe that's part of what's so scary about it too. Is that like you can't trust your own mind and you can't trust your own senses.
You're exactly right. The ghost is the ultimate gaslighter.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yes.
it's that idea of you thinking of like how you can mess with somebody by just every now and then just moving something ever so slightly and then it's never saying a word and then coming back and seeing if they've noticed and
Yes.
and if you walk into a room that you've become very familiar with and something is just ever so slightly different, it bothers you even if you can't quite put your finger on what has happened, and the ghost can do that to the extreme degree that sometimes you'll see them in a reflection, turn around, they're not there. Sometimes something will just move across a room. Even if they're not physically, tangibly present, they can be watching you and you can feel it. And
Hmm.
any number of things. They can go Freddy Krueger on you and invade your dreams, you know. A lot of the time, a ghost story can lean into these much more psychological gaslighty elements, which is I think
Yes.
that is one of the things that makes them scary. I think another thing that does make ghosts conceptually scary, especially the horror ghost, is that unlike a person, even a slasher person, like your Jasons or your Michael
Hmm.
Myers, who they're still theoretically people, on Jason not so much, but Michael Myers for sure, which means they're a physical thing that can be defended against or even killed in theory. But a
Right.
ghost, you can't really do anything to protect yourself from a ghost in a lot of them. I mean, there's often like little supernatural elements like ritual circles or salt or whatever, but depending on the mythology. But by and large, a ghost is able to pass through walls. They can
But yeah, no, I think you're talking about ghosts, they can go through walls. You can't really kill them because they're
because they're
already
already
dead.
dead. You
Right. So
can't
it's like,
hide from them because they can just pop through a wall, or maybe they're just haunting you specifically. Generally speaking, to remove a ghost as a threat, you've got to put it to rest in some way.
right,
Religious compulsion or removing what it's tethered to, but more often than not, solving its unfinished business,
right. Yes.
which, I think makes them threatening in a way that a mundane horror villain can't be.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree.
And I've got a list here of the different ways you get horror ghosts, but it generally comes down to either they are inherently summoned by some sort of deity or necromancer or whatever, or you've got the variety where they were already evil and they're just trying to avoid hell by hanging around on Earth. But the most common is the vengeful entity, which is just something that remained haunting a place, an object, person, bloodline to enact some sort of punishment for a slight that they have experienced. You
Right.
know, that's the most common kind. You know, you've got again Freddy Krueger, our favorite dream invader, was murdered for being a terrible, terrible human being and took offense to that. You've got your Sadako Samara from The Ring, who becomes a vengeful ghost because of being sealed in a well. The Dullahan Headless Horseman didn't take kindly to being decapitated. I'd say that's the most common variety. It's usually some sort of vengeful entity.
Right. Yeah.
So I suppose ultimately the way you get through a horror ghost scenario is find a way to help it make peace.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you can't just kill it. You gotta do a little bit more digging than that, which I also think is, we'll probably get to this, but the whole mystery aspect of ghost stories is there's often, like you said, a mystery to be solved of like, how did this ghost die? What do they want? How can we, figure out how to put it at rest? So there is that, often that mystery element that
Yeah, I
the main
mean,
characters have to solve.
mysteries are a great driving mechanism for a story, and ghosts definitely do lead themselves to that, especially. Well, not especially. I'd say all ghosts have this in varying shades, but it adds an element of necessity when you make it a
Hmm.
horror ghost because you're on a timer. You have to solve the mystery before the ghost kills you or possesses you or does some other horrible thing to you.
Right. Makes you so crazy you jump out the window in fear,
And
Yeah.
then you're stuck hanging out with it forever.
Right.
Just a collection of ghosts being progressively driven more mad by the I'm sure it's been done. That's probably the mythos behind a lot of haunted houses. But
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's urgency is always good in a horror story. So I think you're right. Like that feeling of we have to figure out this very convoluted mystery. Not only are we haunted to begin with, but who is haunting us, why, and how do we make them go away? Adds adds this inherent tension when it's on a time limit and we have to do it before we are driven out, killed, possessed, all this other horrible stuff. Ghosts are just
Hmm.
a fantastic tool for horror stories.
I agree. I agree.
I suppose actually there is one thing to draw some attention to out when it comes to sort of your horror ghosts, I suppose, is that horror ghost and malicious ghost aren't necessarily the same thing.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm debating when to bring this up because this was my favorite ghost story all through childhood. And I can't remember if you said you had read it, Wait Till Helen Comes by Mary
I
Downing Hahn.
haven't.
Oh, it's so, I mean, well, I don't know. I'm biased because I started reading it when I was in third grade and then just would read it, 5 or 6 times a year for the next however many 10 years or something. So I'm clearly very biased. But in this book, the ghost is a girl who had died and for various reasons, I don't want to be spoilery, but for various reasons, she had some unfinished business and is basically trying to lure other children into the pond so that she isn't alone. And she befriends this kind of angry little girl who uses Helen to get back at her step family. So Helen is ultimately not a bad, she's just a little girl ghost, but she is doing malicious things in the name of making friends and hoping that she's going to lure this other, living little girl into the pond to be her, BFF in death forever. So I do think that there are ghosts that are doing scary bad things, but they're doing it for a reason. And again, it's that mystery of like, okay, why are they doing this? What do they really want? How can we, put them at peace? So anyway,
Yeah, I mean
yeah.
it's a fine line, I think, between malicious and straight up horror. And
Hmm.
all I think even if the action's the same, I think a lot of it comes down to how it is framed by the creator, the writer, the artist, whatever. Because it's such a hard thing to really describe the lens it comes through, the framing of it. But the same action can easily be played for, this is some funny shenanigans as what is happening in our house. And some of that just comes down to are the lights on or not.
Right, right. Well, do you have an example of a malicious ghost outside of the horror genre?
Sure do. We're being very topical for the time of recording and not at all for the time this episode comes out. Beetlejuice,
I was actually thinking about Beetlejuice. Yeah.
who is just the worst. He's
Right.
just such an obnoxious entity. But and in any other genre would probably be terrifying, the things he's doing, messing with the shapes of people's faces and doing weird possession marriages and things like that. It's been a while since I've seen the first one, haven't seen the second one yet. Don't shoot me, audience. I'll watch it. Uh, but because of the way the movie is framed and written, it's comedic. It's not,
Right.
oh God, this is such a terrifying entity. It is this guy's such a bastard, which
Yeah,
is
yeah.
very different.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess you could put Ghostbusters in that as well,
Good
where,
old Slimer, yeah.
you've got a lot of ghosts that are just there for comedic relief. Or, I mean, I think I would call that movie comedy. I don't know.
It's
My
it's
I
definitely a
was telling
comedy.
my husband, and he was like, "There are some scary parts," and I was like, "Yeah, but I think it's
Yeah,
still
but it's a
considered a
comedy.
comedy." Yeah.
One jump
So,
scare a horror movie does not make.
yeah, yeah.
But
Okay. Oh, go ahead.
but yeah, it is interesting that fine line that just comes down so much to just how you want to portray something, which is just another reason that ghosts are incredibly versatile, where you can make the same thing scary or funny depending on how you want to. Although I'm a big proponent of writing horror and writing comedy are not that different. And I could get into
Really?
that. Yeah, I could get into that for a while. Basically, the formula for a good joke and the formula for a good jump scare are exactly the same.
Ah, yeah.
Set
Okay.
up,
I see where you're
subversion of
going with that.
expectations, punchline.
Yep. Yep. Okay. I wouldn't have thought of that, but now when you say it, I'm like, yeah, that makes sense.
It's something I've thought about a lot for no reason. But yes, I think we can, if it's good with you, we can move on to
Yes.
yeah. So moving on from our horror ghosts, then I think the next sort of broad category that you see the most of, and I think we have arguably the most to say about going by the sort of shared document we have for the
Hmm.
itinerary is actually tragic ghosts, which is interesting. You would
Yeah.
think that horror would be the main thing to discuss, but as it turns out, there's a lot to be said about the more tragic figures. So, speaking simply enough, ghosts are not confined to depictions of maliciousness. They can, in fact, also be depicted as tragic figures. Sometimes they're both.
Hmm.
Looking at the aforementioned example of like Sadako, Samara from The Ring, and many others aside, but generally speaking, two different types of story we're looking at here, two very different vibes.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
unfinished business isn't always vengeful. Sometimes a ghost is kept around because of guilt, because they can't bear to let someone or something go, because of fear of what comes next, or just because there's some task or goal they weren't able to complete while alive.
Yeah, and I think this is probably my favorite type of ghost story because it does, like I said earlier, lend itself to that mystery aspect of figuring out, first of all, is there actually a ghost? And then, who are they? How did they die? What do they want? Why are they here? And yeah, like you said, often it's because they died too soon and maybe they're trying to figure out their own death or they're trying to figure out their own murder or they're trying to get, I guess is it in the Lovely Bones she's almost trying to stop the murderer from doing it again, right? That's kind of why she's sticking around.
She's such an interesting example. I have what is it? I have her name here somewhere.
Well, it's written by
It's
Alice Sebold, but I don't remember the
Susie. The
character's
ghost
name.
name is
Susie,
Susie.
that's right.
Susie Salmon, I think it is.
Yes. Yes.
And I note her as a very interesting example because she's torn between being a vengeful ghost and a guardian spirit almost.
Oh, yeah, it's been a long time. I read the book years ago, I think when it first came out, and then I think I saw the movie too, but it's been a while. But yeah, it obviously stuck with us both.
Well, it's
Because
interesting.
it's such an
I've
interesting
only seen
example.
pieces of the movie a long time
Oh,
ago. I don't think
really?
I've ever seen the whole way through. But the idea of the story kept coming up for me when I like just in my head when I was researching this, and I didn't get time to go back and watch it or read it. But
Yeah.
I know enough to discuss it, I think, and it did just warrant as such an
Well,
interesting example to me.
it's an interesting example, I think, because it's got that, um, it's got a thriller aspect to it because you've got an actual real life murderer, right? Who is going to strike again. But then you've got this ghost that's like trying to stop him. So you've kind of got that ticking time clock. I don't know, it sort of takes a lot of the elements we were talking about, but twists them in a different way. Um, but I think that that is something that you do see, in a lot of ghost stories too, is it's like something happened in the past and now it's sort of being brought back in the present, and so the ghost is almost being like kind of dredged up to, like, I don't know, kind of stop it from happening again, or to kind of watch over. I'm thinking in particular, I don't know if you've read any of Jennifer McMahon's novels,
I
but this is,
haven't. Honestly, there are so many authors I need to read, by which I mean all of them. I wish I was better read than I am a lot of the time.
well, I understand that there's so much, but yeah, she often will kind of do this idea of, like, there's something that happened in the past, and now, the person has come back to town and is like literally being haunted by the ghosts of the past. But there's some trigger that sort of brings that ghost into the forefront. Whether it's like in Susie's case where she's trying to stop another person from getting murdered, or whether it's you know um yeah, I don't know, it's just that idea of like the past kind of coming back
But
around again.
it's that link between the idea of the ghost story and memory again,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't at all in my notes as a thing to talk about. But the more we discuss it, the more it becomes clear that there is a very distinct link here between this theme of like memory and history and the idea of ghosts, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
Yeah, yeah. And well, I was thinking too about, I would like to go on the haunted history tours in different towns. So, the haunted history tour in New Orleans or in Savannah, or all of these kind of places in the US that people think of as sort of being haunted.
We have something
And
like that in a Fremantle, which is relatively close to where I am. We have this like really old prison. They do sort of haunted night tours of.
ooh, yeah, that sounds spooky and good. But yeah, but it's the link between, and so often in the South, there are ghosts of slaves, or like ghosts of, men who were lynched, and it's it's like the trauma of the past is still here in this location. You can't kill that trauma, kind of, the ghost is still there. So there is so much of kind of history and memory baked into the idea of a ghost, I think.
Yeah, and oftentimes the haunting is both literal and metaphorical.
Yes, yes. Bingo. That that is what I like so much, is it's like the memory and the trauma made manifest in this
Yeah,
ghost or this
the
haunting.
ghost is exactly, it's like this physical seems like the wrong word to use when talking about a ghost, but it's like the physical incarnation of the entire plot and theme of the story. It's great.
Right. Yes. Yeah,
And
totally.
so you've touched on a lot of things that I really like about the tragic ghost as well through all this. But you mentioned that these are your favorite kinds of ghost story. And interestingly enough, the more I think about it, as much as I love horror, these might be my favorite type too.
Yeah, there's just so much to dig into, I think, in the tragic ghost story. And you also often get that atmospheric. I mean, you're getting, the spooky, scary atmospheric, but then there's you dig down and there's all these like psychological layers to it.
Yeah, they tend to be very complex stories, which not like bad, complicated either, like but layered and poignant. And I'm a sucker for the poignant and the bittersweet and the tragic.
Hmm.
And it's interesting because despite being fantastical by nature, a tragic ghost touches upon some very human experiences and feelings, like deeply human. So it's really easy to relate to the characters and themes in a tragic ghost story and become very, very invested as a result.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Are you thinking of any in particular that when you think about this tragic ghost story that you
Many, but um, examples that people are likely to be familiar with. I'm going to save one because it's actually going to be the next episode.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'll
But
have to listen.
some examples that come to mind. There is a story that, admittedly, I've not read, but I am somewhat familiar with, which is the Ghost and Mrs. Moya.
Okay. I
There's
haven't read it.
this ghost Daniel Gregg who is like a sea captain who has died, and this lady Mrs. Moya moves into his house, and this actually touches on something else because basically the tragic element is that they fall for each other, but one's a ghost,
Mhm.
so it's literally being romantically attached to the past, and it's not really a feasible thing, and there's tragedy in that. There's
Mhm.
also Kyra Collins and Malcolm Crowe from The Sixth Sense.
Mhm.
The names might it's a bit of it's an old movie at this point. The names might throw some people. So Malcolm Crowe is of course out spoilers protagonist, who in case you somehow don't know this plot twist was dead all along. And Kyra Collins is this ghost of a little girl that he and the boy who can see the dead people help because she has been being like poisoned by her stepmother or something over time.
Mhm.
Help her like find closure, reveal what happened, and move on. I think the Bent Net lady from Netflix's haunting version of The Haunting of Hill House is another example of a tragic ghost because she
Mhm.
ends up being the tragic ghost because she is haunted by her past herself and
Right.
also kind of by herself because there's some weird stuff going on there.
Yeah, I think also a lot of times the ghosts, well, I mentioned it in the Wait Till Heaven Comes, but it's like they're lonely and they're not where they're supposed to be, you know? And so there's sort of some tragedy in that of like they're kind of stuck in this, they haven't moved on, and so there's some tragedy in them being kind of stuck and lonely and out of place.
Yeah, I mean, the tragic ghosts they play into a lot of really human anxieties, damaged relationships, failing to meet our goals in the limited time we have, dying and leaving no legacy behind, or just being alone with perpetually no one there for you because you are an entity that most people can't see, or that they fear you and you have no real way to interact with them beyond that. A tragic ghost plays into a lot of these really human, ordinary insecurities and anxieties that everyone can relate to, I think, which is one of the reasons they tend to hit so hard in that sort of bittersweet department because you're watching that and going, "Oh, I'm the dead guy."
Yeah. I did just recently rewatch Ghost for this podcast and also because it was Halloween time, with Demi Moore and Patrick Swayze, which is another like, well, I think we're going to talk about romance as a
As
genre for
part of
ghost stories too.
that's interesting that yeah, there was something really in our notes there that I noticed that was very interesting about that.
Yeah, but it was interesting with Ghost because, and I feel like this happens a lot in these 80s and 90s movies where they're kind of trying to appeal to everyone. So the movie is like a little bit of every genre. So you've got, the romance between the man and woman, and then of course he dies and becomes a ghost. So you've kind of got this romance between the woman and the ghost, but then it's also he's trying to solve his own murder, and there's also a lot of comedy with, him trying to manipulate the physical world. So it's kind of like all of the genres mashed up into one. But ultimately it is tragic because they, really loved each other and they were going to get married, and now he's died, and then the last image is like a ghostly kiss and then off he goes, so they're never going to get to have that life that they had imagined. So I would count that as a tragic ghost story.
Well, it's see that's one of the things that's really interesting is because obviously the audience don't get to see our notes, but when we put together this like itinerary document and I sent it to Eva, I was like, yeah, if you just want to fill in like any extra like things in here you think I've missed, you included sort of ghost romance as a separate genre.
Hmm.
And I sort of messaged you after this and I was like, it's really interesting that you've done this because I didn't do that purely because I think that a ghost romance is inherently tragic.
Mm, yeah, yeah. I see what you mean because it can never be. It can never,
Yeah,
last.
it's
Yeah.
it's that it's inherently that sort of star-crossed lovers. It can never happen, really. It's fleeting. In order for this person to find peace, they have to move on from you. It's got all those sort of classic things just naturally baked into it by virtue of the whole life and death divide, which is a pretty insurmountable barrier.
Yeah. 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 No, I think you're right that that kind of fits in with the tragic ghosts for sure.
There's also, especially Ghost is a really good example of it, and it's not a romantic ghost, but I mentioned the bent neck lady from Netflix's Hill House is another really good example of this. They're more examples of being tethered to the past, of being
Mm,
stuck in this bygone era in a way, whether that's from a long time ago, like the sea captain in Mrs. Moya, or if it's yourself, your literal own personal history in the case of the Bent Lady, or a more recently departed death that you just can't move past,
right.
which is also in and of itself tragic.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we were saying, what are the reasons why ghosts stay? And one of them is either they just don't want to move on, they can't let go, or sometimes it's that their loved ones are the ones that need to let them go, and that's part of the story is the letting go.
Yeah, because I mean, your personal tragedies and histories, they're things that you should always remember, I think. I think it's good to keep them in, like, as a part of yourself, but you shouldn't be defined purely by one time in your life. I think that's not a healthy way to be. And I think these stories, these tragic ghost stories, are a really good way of exploring that very human experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, how many more times can I say that? Can I say that ghost stories are human? Trust
Yeah.
me,
I
they
mean,
are.
I wonder if because I know when you were doing the vampire episode, you kind of went back to look for like where were the first examples of vampire stories. But I feel like with ghost stories, this has probably been
It's basically
ever since
impossible.
humans were telling stories, they were telling ghost stories because I think it's just such it's the great unknown, that we don't really know what happens when we die, and so we make up stories, and ghosts is one of those stories that we make up to explain the unexplainable.
I
So,
mean,
yeah.
like I did look into it. That's where that thing about the sort of that sort of ancient, sort of more tribalistic version of the ghost story where ghosts linger by default and then disappear and have their true death when they're forgotten kind of thing.
Hmm.
There's also, the ancient Greek afterlife basically has ghosts in a way that pop up in some sort of ancient Greek legends. Not so much with I couldn't find anything that sprung out for like Egyptian mythology or whatever, but ghost stories, yeah. I mean, there's spirits in indigenous Australian mythology, which,
Hmm.
as best I can tell, sometimes they're dead people and sometimes there's something completely different depending on the tribe. I'm not super well versed in that. I should probably look into it more because it's very interesting. But
Hmm.
I think you're right in that it's other like there's the intrinsic tie that this idea that it is kind of wish fulfillment. It basically, for there to be ghosts, there has to be a soul, there has to be something that lingers on after, there has to be an afterlife. So I think some of it does come down to comfort and paradoxically almost, and so many ghost stories are horror.
Right.
But
Yeah.
it is something that it goes back so far. It's probably almost certainly predates recorded history, the idea of the ghost and ghost stories, I think.
Yeah. Oh, I would imagine so. All right. What's our next? Do we have anything else to say about tragic
That's what I
ghosts?
was just checking.
Yeah,
Uh,
I'm trying to think if I have any other things that I want to mention about tragic ghosts,
oh,
but I think we've
I feel like we've been fairly succinct, but we've kind of touched on a lot of the really important things about tragic ghosts, the sort of link between the inherent tragedy in the ghost romance, the idea of them being based in these ordinary anxieties, loneliness, loss,
hmm
uh, that
I
memory theme again being tied to the past.
I will just mention because I wanted to make sure to mention Beloved by Toni Morrison, which starts out where she's being haunted by the ghost of her dead child, a dead baby, which is like, oh, really tragic. But
That's a whole different kind of horror.
Yeah. Well, I feel like and it's been a long time since I've read Beloved, but it's such I mean, talk about like kind of that more literary and psychological, like your trauma made, made manifest. Like I feel like that's really part of that story. And there's so much there of like the characters are some of the characters are former slaves. And so there's a lot of like that, like we talked about history and the past, but the way it's being expressed in the book is through a ghost story. So I wanted to make sure I gave a little shout out to Toni Morrison for that
I mean,
one.
that's I can't think. I mean, I'm not familiar with the story, but just from what you've described, I can't think of a better example of a like ghost as a representation of grief,
Yes, yes,
which
exactly.
is also common, a very common sort of motive kind of thing in tragic ghost stories, I
Yeah,
think.
exactly.
Which I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Ghost stories are really good,
They
guys.
are. Yes. No matter what you're into. If you're into,
There's something for everyone.
there's something for everyone. Just like an 80s and 90s movie. There's a little bit of everything. Yeah.
But yeah, I do see some things here that are kind of interesting. You've got haunted house stories and poltergeist. I know that there's something I have above those, but I think those are gonna be interesting to touch on
Yeah.
first because I feel like those are inherently related to horror stories.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can have a haunted house that's a horror story. You can have it be sort of more the psychological mystery thriller. Um, and you can have it be a comedy. Like, I mean, Beetlejuice is essentially a haunted house
Yeah, I
story.
suppose you're right.
You
Yeah.
know, there's I also so I have to mention Jennifer McMahon again because she's one of my favorites. But she wrote this book somewhat recently called The Invited, in which a couple is building a house, and they're building a house on this land that, unbeknownst to them, something tragic happened there, and they essentially in various ways build their own haunted house, which I thought was such a cool twist on the whole haunted house trope. Um,
You know, sorry, I'll let you finish
oh
that.
no,
You were
but
quite, oh,
just
my
I do
bad.
think that there's there's so many different types of haunted house. You can say, oh, it's another haunted house story, but there's a lot of different ways to do it, you know.
You've actually just reminded me of something that I watched recently. It was a video essay by this guy, Jacob Geller, who is a much bigger creator than I am and ever will be. Uh, but he wrote a story about haunted houses. Not a story, and he wrote an essay about haunted houses in various media. And he touched upon a couple of game series called Control and Anatomy, where the house was doing the haunting almost,
So it wasn't
where
like
it
an
was
actual
less
ghost, it was the
it wasn't a yeah,
house.
it wasn't a ghost. It was the house itself, its history and things like that. The idea of the house being abandoned is what made it haunted.
Hmm.
Not it was abandoned because it was haunted by a ghost. This idea that of all the history built into our homes is where the haunting has come from.
Right. So it's like the walls have absorbed all of this history and past and yeah, yeah, I see what you're saying.
You don't see it so much in like European Western folklore and mythology, but in a lot of Asian folklore, there's creatures that are like the physical, spiritual manifestations of places or objects come up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Which it's very similar to that idea, the idea of the object almost having a soul and the haunting being rather than the spirit of the deceased, the will and history of this place made incarnate.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things I was thinking about with haunted house, I mean, first of all, they lend itself so well to that atmosphere we were talking about, of like
Oh,
building up the
definitely.
atmosphere of it. But so one of my favorite, I don't know if you'd call it a haunted house story or not, but I'm gonna lump it in here, is The Little Stranger by Sarah Waters, which was also made into a film. I haven't seen the film, but it's very gothic, it's a historical, it's set, I don't know, maybe like around the 1900s. But but the idea that there's all these like manor houses in England and probably the rest of Europe that are falling to ruin, and the people that used to have all of these servants and all of this everything, now they're sort of like living in squalor in this giant falling apart manor, very much kind of lends itself to that idea of like the house itself is like what's driving them mad, or the house itself is like this malevolent creature almost.
Hill House is a bit like that too, actually,
Yeah.
especially the original version, as far as I can tell.
So yeah, so that's a really good one because and I love that kind of gothic tone, which is so atmospheric and tragic. And but I would say the Little Stranger is it's definitely very psychological, and I would say it's more of a poltergeist story, where it's more like there's energy, there's like malicious energy in the house. But yeah, so I guess I'm just saying the haunted house is not standard. You can, do it in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I should not look down on the haunted house. We've just pointed out like four different reasons why they're actually really cool.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, yeah.
and honestly, more respect to haunted houses from me included. Because it's it is again that idea of the haunting being some representation of the past of
Yeah,
history coming up again,
yeah,
and I think that that's possibly the most clear incarnation of that. But it's definitely the best example, almost in my mind, now that you talk about it. The idea of the place being the haunted thing,
hmm,
the source of the haunting, because that is the most literal way you could take being haunted by the
yeah,
past.
yeah, exactly.
I love it when in these episodes we stumble across a through line.
Yeah, and you're like, oh, here it is again. Yeah,
Yeah, this what you like just naturally talk about it, and all of a sudden you're like, wait, no, this keeps coming up. This is actually a thing.
yeah.
I wish this was in my notes because it would make me look real smart, but no.
Sometimes you have to talk it out before you get to it. Yeah.
It's happened a few times through the past couple seasons, and every time it does, I'm like, there's a thing here. Yes, haunted house, good.
Recommend.
Do definitely recommend. And that is as good a terrible segue as any to move on to the next, by that having not a segue at all, but something very different because there's in most of what we've talked about, there's been a lot of sadness or maliciousness. There've been very negative depictions of ghost stories. But ghost stories do not have to be negative. There is an iteration of the ghost story which is dealing with benevolent
Hmm.
spirits, which is another very interesting idea in a lot of ways. This is a lot more common in like children's stories, but it's not unique to them.
Yeah.
Your benevolent spirits, they can be protectors, guides, mentors. Sometimes they serve to help characters navigate death itself. Other times they're using their knowledge or supernaturalness, teach them something, show them something that, or they're just experience from life, the lessons they need to learn of moral variety, save their soul from damnation sort of thing, or just help them move past their own issues, or sometimes they're literal protectors.
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking about the Graveyard Book by Neil Gaiman, where the little boy's parents are killed and he's basically taken in by all the ghosts in the graveyard, and they become his like adoptive parents and literally take care of him. So yeah, I'm trying to think because you're right. It often you see it in children's stories. But I'm sure there's other examples. I have a really kind of fun example. Have you seen Julie and the Phantoms on Netflix? I think
I have
it's like a
not.
teen,
I've never even
yeah,
heard
it's
of
a
it.
teen show, and I don't know if it was based on a book series or not, but it's very cute. It's basically this band in the 90s. They die, I think, from like food poisoning or something.
It does have that sort of X and the
Yeah.
Y band name
And
format.
then so Julie basically forms a band with the ghost guys who died in the 90s. So she has this band with her three, I think it's like three ghost ghost bandmates. So it's just like really, they're clearly benevolent spirits that are like helping her get her record deal or whatever. I can't remember the details. But
That's very
yeah,
funny.
so a little bit of comedy, but a little just, good ghosts, just, doing, helping out.
Yeah, I have a couple things in my notes that check out for these. All very different. because I wanted to cover a few options. So actually, weirdly, the first thing I thought of with the idea of a benevolent spirit was Virgil from the
Oh,
Divine Comedy.
yeah. Yeah.
Uh,
Leading the way.
and
Yeah.
also Beatrice and Saint Bernard, as it turns out, because they quite literally they serve as Dante's guide through the various parts of the afterlife. They are helping him achieve religious enlightenment and understanding,
Hmm.
and arguably be a better person as a result, which is one of the oldest examples I could think of benevolent spirit, but is also just so almost like the archetypical example of the spirit guiding you through the
Right.
afterlife.
Yeah.
But then you've got some other examples. You know, you have the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future from A Christmas Carol.
Oh, yeah. I didn't even, that's such a classic ghost example. I didn't even think about it.
Yeah. Or I suppose technically in the original text it's of Christmases yet to come, not
Mm,
future, I think. But I think it was like the Disney version that changed it to future because it's just so much catchier.
yeah.
Um, which is there's your sort of moral guide, benevolent spirits. They're a little spooky because they're ghosts. They've got to keep to the branding, but they're all about teaching why you shouldn't be greedy and how to be generous, which is an example of ghosts as moral guides.
Hmm. Yeah.
And here I've also got the Lovely Bones again,
Yeah.
which has two examples of two very different types of a benevolent spirit, which is another reason it's such an interesting example for me because you've got Susie, who is a literal who is a guardian spirit. She's torn between protection and vengeance, I guess, in a way, but she's still an example of a protective benevolent spirit because she's trying to prevent her sister, I believe, is actually the target, and
Mm,
others from
mm,
being murdered the same way she was. But there's also the character of Holly, who serves who is another one of the murdered girls, but she serves this sort of helping Susie move on kind of benevolent spirit. So it's got a couple of examples in The Lovely
oh, I
Bones.
had forgotten about the Holly character. Yeah.
Yeah, I had two until I just started researching this. I was like, oh yeah, that was a thing. I forgot how much of that story takes place in the afterlife, actually.
Right, which is then I'm like, okay, does it count if we're in the afterlife? But I think it counts.
I'm counting
Yeah.
it. It's a dead person
Yeah. It's a
doing things other than being dead.
And I was also trying to remember, I believe it is narrated by Susie. The book is narrated by Susie. And I do think that's also a thing that you see. I would say another trope of like a book being narrated by the ghost and like kind of watching, like I'm thinking of Rooms by Lauren Oliver, I think is narrated by these various ghosts that live in a house and are watching the people who now live in the house. But yeah, I think that's as a writer, I can see why that's really fun because you're like it's almost like an omniscient narrator in a way. Like you can kind of get that like bird's eye view of what's going on, and you maybe can know some things that a normal character wouldn't know when the character narrating is a ghost. So I can see the like fun of being like, "Ooh, I'm going to tell this story from the ghost's point of view."
The idea of a story just being a ghost, basically like looking on like this is reality TV, is very interesting.
Yeah, I haven't read Rooms in a long time, but I thought it was a really fun way to it's in a way it's a little Beetlejuicy where the ghosts are like watching this dysfunctional family come into the house and then you're getting kind of like the backstory of the ghosts and why they're there, but you're also getting the story of the living people and what's going on with them. So I would recommend that one.
I'm gonna have to look at that because the idea of just look, if we're stuck in this house for eternity, we may as well people
Yeah.
watch is great.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, now that you mention it as well, I think that's one of those things that we talked about earlier as well. Like when it comes to like how certain things, the framing of it changes if they're scary or funny or not,
Hmm.
because perspective is a big part of that. If you're looking through at a story through the eyes of the ghost, it becomes a lot less scary because they're the perspective character. The mystery is stripped away.
Yeah.
They're just an entity dealing with whatever the theme of the story is. Like you could be dealing more with their increased frustrations because of their inability to properly communicate, and that could be portrayed as very funny. But in the exact same like list of plot points from the perspective of the people just living in a house. It could be, oh my God, why is all my stuff moving around? There's cryptic messages in the like condensation on the mirror in the shower or whatever. And it's interesting because depending on perspective, that story is either a benevolent spirit trying to communicate something important, or it's terrifying.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. That,
A story doesn't have to be one or the other. You can have a benevolent spirit that's also scary, which is just kind of fun.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so looking at that juxtaposition between scary and funny, I actually think is a really good jumping point to go on to one of the last things on the list I have for types of ghost story, which is sort of ghost hunting media. Uh,
Ooh, yes.
which what I'm talking about when I say that is the sort of things that are created by people like the books written by Ed and Lorraine Warren or like Ghost Hunters or the million supernatural haunted house YouTube series that are out there. Stuff that, while created by people who are misguided at best and actively scamming you at worst, is actually a rather effective form of ghost story.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't have a lot of experience with the like ghost hunting stuff, but I will say that I get very sucked into a story that has a medium, whether it's like that old-timey kind of spiritualist type of thing or more modern day. And I like the trope where it's a medium who's scamming people, but then it turns out they actually do have some hidden talent that
That
comes out. So that's
that's fun.
I love that. Yeah.
As a side note, though, if you are a quotation marks medium and you are scamming the grieving and the people who are dealing with sadness and loss, you are the worst.
Agree with that. 100% agree with that. Yes. I think it's interesting to read about in fiction, but I don't want to read about it in real life.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
see you on your TV shows profiting off of other people's misery. You suck.
Yes.
Which
Totally,
is
totally agree with that.
which is the politest version of this rant that you are ever going to get from me.
Yeah, I was expecting more of a rant. I was ready.
I
So if you
yeah, I
have
did I, did-
more,
I did put I put this in the notes that just that this was a warning that I when we go into this topic it was probably going to happen, but out of courtesy for my guest, I have removed all of the expletives,
yeah. No, I mean
of which there would normally be many.
it is like if you think about, okay, so I'll go back to Ghost because that's a familiar example where the Whoopi Goldberg character is exactly what I'm saying, where she is straight up scamming people, and but it's played like comedy, and but if you think about what that would really look like in real life, I mean, you are preying on grieving people and taking their money, and she's even like, oh, I'm not sure if I can find your husband. It's going to take a little bit more cash, or I mean, that's just horrible. And I think the, redeeming factor in that story is that it turns out she really does have the ability and she, helps the Patrick Swayze character basically solve his unfinished business.
Also, being played by Whoopi Goldberg just inherently make you more likable. So,
Right, exactly. Yeah, but that's one of those things where if you really drill down into it, you're like, okay, this is playing it like it's funny, but if an actual person were doing this in real life, it would be 100% the
oh yeah,
opposite of funny. It would be
things that are
really,
entertaining in fiction are often not so entertaining in reality. Uh,
yeah, yeah.
but I wanted to touch on this, not just to get that off my chest, but because things like Ed and Lorraine Warren's books, which inspired the Conjuring and Annabelle movies and things like that.
Oh, is
Uh,
that who she is? Okay, I
that's
didn't recognize
them.
the name.
You or things like Ghost Hunters, while certainly fabricated, or at the very most exaggerated or otherwise twisted, makes for some really immersive fiction because it is
Hmm.
presented as academic fact.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's presented as like scientific and oh, we've got these recordings and yeah, so it's very compelling.
Yeah. So even if you recognize that the shams for what they are, it can still I can see why you would still find entertainment in it. Like I know people who do not believe in ghosts. They despise these people as much as I do, but they still find these things entertaining because of this weird, almost immersive, pseudo-scientific fictional reality that is being created by this media, which it's just
Hmm.
it's really interesting to me that this happens because I can't think of anything else in the world of fiction or of ghost stories, whatever, that is like this, where I mean, all fiction is kind of like that, where it's not real, but you still find it compelling anyway. But
Yeah,
it's just such a weird niche where it's not real. The people doing it know it's not real, but you are collectively agreeing to pretend it is for the length of the book or the show.
right. And I don't even know if you'd call it suspended disbelief because like you said, you still kind of you don't really believe the whole time, but you're still getting enjoyment and entertainment out of it.
I think it's a really good example of how giving a vibe of authenticity just leads to immersion.
Hmm.
If you
Well, it's
present something as real, it feels more real.
it's like I think the Victorians did this a lot where they would start their novel with like, I found this letter upon the,
Yes.
notes
Uh,
of
that's
some certain
basically
person.
that's
Yeah.
Dracula in a nutshell. It's presented as like logs from a guy's diary for a lot of it.
Yeah, and well, I did want to just mention because also Legend of Sleepy Hollow does this, I believe. But I wanted to mention Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and this is probably off topic of where we are now, but just because I think it's a really interesting example of if you actually read the short story from Washington Irving, there's actually no ghosts in the story. Like the what is his name? Ichabod, like here's the story of the headless horseman from the old ladies on the porch, but he never actually sees the headless horseman. He never actually sees or interacts with any ghosts. It's all just vibes. Like the entire short story is just vibes and him getting scared of like hearing creepy noises in the woods. And you compare that to
That
when they
is really
did the
cool.
movie of it with Johnny Depp and by Tim Burton and Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham or no, Christina Ricci. But in they totally took the like vibes of the short story and just made it straight up horror. you know. But in the actual short story, like I think, he basically leaves town because he just gets too spooked, but there was no ghost interaction.
That is
So
really interesting. I did not know that at all.
yeah, yeah. It's like everybody thinks like, oh, it's like such a famous ghost story. And it's like, well, go back and read it. Actually, no ghost there in the whole story, just vibes.
That is so interesting.
Yeah. So that was when we were talking about, there's kind of that psychological, is there a ghost at all, or is it all just in the person's mind? That's definitely one where it's just Ichabod's imagination running away with him.
Well, yeah, I mean, because we did touch on that there is a brand of ghost story which is it's usually some sort of horror, but that sort of psychological ghost story where it's like, are you actually being haunted by something, or is it all in your head? And if it's all in
Right.
your head, why is it all in your head?
Which again is very can be very scary. Like, there's I think
It's
the
almost
like
more scary because it's your personhood is almost being violated in a way when it's a question of am I seeing things or is this really happening?
yeah, like it's the horror story is your own descent into madness or the character's descent into madness. That's like which is also terrifying. Like I would say probably just as terrifying as a real ghost or more so.
Yeah, if not more so.
So,
I find that the idea of going insane much scarier than the idea of a ghost. Um,
yeah. Yeah.
and and what you like Legend of Sleepy Hollow is exactly that, which is very interesting to me.
Yeah.
Or it's not a ghost story, but the Raven almost
Hmm.
is that
Yeah, a
kind of
lot
thing
of
as
Poe
well.
stories. Yeah, they're it's the descent into madness, you know.
Poe being familiar
Yeah.
with the Descent into Madness, who could have seen that coming?
So, yeah. So I think going back to I think I do like that psychological element that's in so many ghost stories. Um yeah. And I think that's I don't know, in kind of like this mediums and ghost hunting and I don't know, there's a psychological element to that too of like what do we really believe and why, I don't know. There's something there as well. I have gone to a couple of mediums in quote unquote research for my books, but I also was just really curious. And I mean, I think there's something in the fact of like they're storytellers, that I don't know.
Well, it's that idea of immersive fiction again. It's
Mhm.
it's 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 actively putting yourself in as part of the story.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, that's you are the character. Yeah, and I mean, I went into it like I was like I really want to believe in this, but I don't think I actually do. But I went into it from a very much just like curiosity and like let's see what this is all about. I do, going back to what you said, I think there are people that go into it who are truly grieving, and that's a whole nother issue. But if you're going into it from the like idea of like, well, let's see what this person says and I'll get a, they're going to tell me a good story, I'm going to get a good story out of it, there is an
And then
element
I'm
of
going
kind
to
of.
write it down.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I did totally like use some of the, not so much what they said, but their sort of mannerisms and sort of the atmosphere of it. And you can get a medium reading through Zoom these days.
Yeah, you
So
can do a
I
lot through Zoom these days.
yeah, yeah. You can get energy work done through Zoom. I've done a lot of research into these things for some of the stuff that I write. Um, but yeah, so there's a weird paranormal world out there of people who at least sometimes I think that they really believe that they are like communicating with the spirit world, and I just don't know if I believe that they are, but I feel like they believe that they are, you know. I don't know.
Which is in
It's a
and of
weird
itself
world.
its own kind of immersive fiction. Hey,
Mm-hmm.
full circle.
Yep. Yep.
Uh, but I mean, it does bring to question. There's all these different types of ghost stories, so many different types. Horror stories, malicious but not scary, comedic, benevolent, tragic, the ones that think they're real. And it makes you wonder what even makes these stories good? Like, what is a good ghost story? Because the one thing I had to note about this is it's really, really hard to say what makes for a good ghost story because it depends almost entirely on what the type of ghost story is and what you want to accomplish by telling that story. A lot of it just comes down to basic good fiction rules in general.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It depends on sort of what genre you're in and what type of ghost story you're telling. And yeah, I mean, I do think for a lot of ghost stories, there is that element the vibes or the, kind
So
of the
much of it just comes down
setting.
to vibes,
Yeah. Right.
which is the
Um,
hardest thing to define.
yeah.
Anytime I stumble across something for these podcast episodes and the answer is just vibes, I'm like, God damn it.
Yeah. But but yeah, I mean, I guess, and then it's like, yeah, it is so hard to say, but I do think for a lot of the ghost stories, whether it's a horror or not, you are wanting to set kind of that spooky tone, even if it turns out to be a benevolent or a tragic ghost. There's still an element of spookiness because you are talking about someone who's dead, whose, spirit has come back. So I think there is
Yeah,
always kind of that spooky element to it.
or if not, it's funny, you say spooky, but I almost think it's more morose than spooky.
Mm,
Even in horror stories, there's everything has this weight to it that other stories don't seem to.
mhm.
Like the specter of death is literally hanging over the story almost. Like I think
Yeah,
about
yeah.
reading The Exorcist, and a better example is watching the movie of The
Oh,
Exorcist. There is just something about that movie where even in scenes where nothing scary is happening, like just the scenes of like up the staircase or a lamppost at night, or just two guys sitting wherever they were sitting in the movie and having a conversation. I don't know if it's something about the way it's shot or there's something about the way it's written in the script, but there's everything just has this heaviness to it, which
yeah.
adds some sort of authenticity or legitimacy to it that I haven't quite been able to put my finger on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to speak to The Exorcist because that movie scared the living shit out of me, and I have not been able to watch it since. I think I watched it when I was 19, and it haunted me, no pun intended, for years. But so clearly, whatever they did, they were doing it right. But I do think, you know, when you're writing a ghost story, kind of choosing what your character is seeing in the surroundings of like, are they noticing the beautiful flowers or are they noticing like a dead squirrel on the road? Like all of these things that you're using in your description of like what is it that the characters or the narrator is choosing to highlight, and if they're
Yeah.
choosing to highlight things that give it that weightiness, that death, that macabre or like morose.
Especially if it's like in contrast to something. Like if it's a dead
Mm-hmm.
squirrel and a field of beautiful flowers, that really sets a tone, especially when you choose to focus on,
Yeah.
instead of the beauty, the squirrel.
Yeah, so when I was getting my MFA, I remember one of our first workshops, we got a writing exercise, and the exercise was write about a beautiful place and then write about something terrible happening there, or write about a horrible, terrible place and something beautiful happening there. Obviously, I chose to write about a beautiful place with something terrible happening there because I like ghost stories and tragic things. But I think you're right. Sometimes that juxtaposition is really, for lack of better word, spooky or
That's a really fun challenge. Sorry.
yeah. Oh, yeah. No, feel free to use that writing exercise. I
I
got a
I
short story out of it.
I really like that. It's like because I'm inclined to do what you did and gravitate towards making something horrible happen somewhere beautiful because I mean you've seen
Right.
the books I write. They're not happy.
Yeah.
Uh, Bad things happen to the people who least deserve them all the time in my stories. But there's something really interesting to me now about like thinking about the idea of having like a really horrible location where something beautiful happens is really
Hmm.
interesting. And, I mean, that's a
Yeah.
great format for a ghost story. Have like some
Yeah.
haunted place where some horrible tragedy has occurred and make it beautiful. That sounds fantastic.
All right.
Someone get
That's
on
your
that, win
challenge.
that Oscar.
That's right. Yeah.
Oscar. Hmm. That's the right award, I think.
But yeah, I think, yeah, I just think ghost stories are, I think they're fun to read. They're fun to write. I really enjoy writing something that has an element of ghostliness to it. Part of it is the vibes. I think it's fun to, kind of set that scene for people.
It's definitely a genre where the vibe carries a lot of it. I mean, obviously you want
Hmm.
quality writing, compelling characters and all that stuff as well, but the atmosphere contributes so much to a ghost story that it's bordering being a character itself.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree.
And it determines so much of how you're going to see everything else that follows.
Hmm. Right, exactly. Because it's, kind of like you were saying about the setup, but it's like if your narrator is, cluing you into the heavy and the dark and the spooky, then it's setting up your mind so that whatever comes next, you're sort of already in that place.
And you see that's good fun for a writer because either you've set the right mood and you've created emotion, or you have the option of then completely subverting the entire mood you've just set, which can also be
Right.
very impactful.
Yeah, and I mean I think you see that a lot in movies, maybe like kind of comedies where like they're setting you up to like expect that something scary is going to happen, and then oh, surprise, it's something silly or it's something
Yeah,
funny.
the
And
horror
I think you
comedy
can,
does that all the time.
yeah, you can definitely do that in books as well. I just have one random example of the Mediator series by Meg Cabot. And so Meg Cabot, she's famous for writing like the Princess Diaries and stuff, but she also wrote this series about a girl who can communicate with ghosts. And it's kind of like, it's almost like Veronica Mars, but with ghosts, where she's like kind of trying to solve their problems and get them to rest in peace. But
Spooky Nancy Drew.
yeah, yeah, but it's very much where it like kind of will set you up to think, oh, something scary is going to happen. And then, oh, it's just the ghost who lives in her room and she
Wait
kind
a
of has a
minute, this is
crush
just
on
Ghost
him because,
Whisperer.
you know, but yeah, so I think that there's a lot you can do to kind of subvert reader expectations in a fun or unusual way when
I
you're
mean,
dealing with
playing
ghosts.
with expectations is always very fun, and when you're mashing genres together and things like that, you have a lot of opportunities to do that, and you can do that a lot with ghost stories. So
Yes. Yeah. I do. I also really enjoy the kind of like I don't know, I got my MFA, so I do try to read more literary fiction sometimes. And I love when a literary novel just goes for it with ghosts and it's like they're using it in sort of that metaphorical way, but they're like, yeah, I'm just gonna go for it and I'm gonna put ghosts in here and I don't know. I'm just a fan. I'm a fan of all types of ghost stories.
Ghost stories as part of literary is completely fine in my book. All literary fiction is another name for saying drama.
Mm-hmm.
It's just character driven. If you want to make one of those characters a ghost, go for it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Make it the most compelling ghost you can.
So, oh, well, I was going to ask you, do you have like a favorite ghost story, like, or maybe top favorites?
Um, yes, definitely. I mean, but a lot of it depends on the story. I mean, I've mentioned it already. I'm a big fan of The Exorcist. I think that is
Oh,
a really good ghost story as far as horror goes because it's so invasive.
I mean, if we're saying like the scariest movie ever, yes. Like, and so I think it does a very good job because it is terrifying. Yes.
But my favorite ghost story actually is an animated series with a very long title, uh, and also it's the topic for next episode. So uh,
Are you allowed to say, or is
I
it
can. I'm just
a
trying to remember the
surprise?
English title because it's really long.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Japanese do this thing where they have like titles that are like the length of a book, and sometimes they get longer even when you translate them.
Oh my gosh.
It's frequently shortened to Anohana, which it's something about flowers, I think. And it's the story is basically this guy wakes up one day and he's being haunted by the ghost of a friend he had as a younger kid who died in
Hmm.
this tragic accident. And the entire story centers around these people who have grown apart as they've gone into their sort of later teen years from when they were younger because of this tragic death. Largely, it created this rift in the group. And
Mm-hmm.
this ghost girl just pops up out of nowhere and is like, "Well, I'm going to resolve all of your issues now, except not not without a lot of complicated drama." And the whole story is basically this group of people finally gradually getting over all this like grief and trauma that they have never unpacked. And not just them,
Mm-hmm.
but also some people who are tangentially related, like the family of the dead girl and things like that. And finally getting over this death and coming back together and rekindling their friendships and relationships and processing it all. And it's very beautiful.
Oh, all right. Well, I'll have to listen to the episode on it.
Yeah, it's I'm going to talk about that one a lot. I've warned John that that's coming. That's my pick for the cycle, and he's just gonna have to deal with it. And in fact, now that I've said this on a recording that comes first, he has no choice. We can't change it now.
That's right.
What about you? Because you've mentioned you really like ghost stories. You've got a lot. So have you got a personal favorite?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I did mention my childhood favorite, Wait Till Helen Comes. And I think the thing I like about that too is it's at its heart, it's about this blended family where, there's three children and one from a previous marriage. Anyway, so it's about a blended family and the ghost originally is being kind of used by one of the children to antagonize the step family, but in the end as they kind of solve the mystery it brings them closer together. So I don't know, there's just a really nice, it's a middle grade book. It's for, I mean, I read it for the first time in third grade. So I don't know, it's just, I feel like it's a complex story for that age group. I don't know what it says about me that
I
I was
mean,
so obsessed with it
I
because when
mean,
I was
I feel like people often look down on like what kids that age are actually capable of comprehending and understanding. So
Yeah, yeah. And I was like explaining it to someone the other day because I said I was going on this podcast. I was like, yeah, my favorite book as a kid was this story about this girl who dies in a pond and then she's trying to lure other children into the pond. And they were like, oh, and I was like, well, I don't know what to tell you. Like, I guess kids can handle more than we think they can. But so that one, but then I would also say I really do enjoy all of Jennifer McMahon's books. And I mentioned The Invited, which I maybe I would say is one of my top, definitely top haunted house story, but maybe top ghost stories. She's just a master of vibes. I mean, she apparently got her MFA in poetry and then just started writing these suspense thrillers with, they almost all have some sort of paranormal element, but she's just really good at setting the mood and, just, yeah. So I would say any of her books. But I'll say The Invited as my other top favorite.
I mean, everything you've mentioned sounds good so far. So, but yeah, we have been going for a while now. We are pushing time a bit. I wanted to go into this whole thing of why do we tell ghost stories and things like that, but I feel like we've touched on that a little bit anyway. So I
Yeah,
think
I
it's
think I
fine.
think we have because we've talked about like it's the ultimate human, what happens after we die,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
So, I think we've touched on that pretty well.
So on that note, I think we can leave our audience there for now then. So for those of you listening to this who are listening to it elsewhere, which is I've said this a few times, it's actually very few of you. Most of you are on my site listening to this for whatever reason. But you can find these episodes on my website, radfordwrites.com, where I also post short stories, usually the ones written for this podcast, but others also. Poetry shows up sometimes, a lot of blog articles and things like that. And of course, you can purchase my books through that site as well. And I always like it when people do that. And where can people find you? What are you doing?
Yes, so I think the best place to find me is on Substack. So you can go to evalangston.substack.com, or if you're already on Substack, you can find me there. And I do a newsletter for writers kind of wherever you are in your writing journey, whether you're just starting out or you're querying agents or beyond. And I give lots of resources and writing tips and all kinds of things there. And then I'm also co-host of a podcast called This Mama is Lit, where we interview writers who identify as mothers or whose work has something to say about motherhood. So you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. And yeah, just I'm also, I'm on Instagram and not so much on X these days, but you can, find me on the internet. I will give you ghost story recommendations because I have more than what I mentioned here.
You just became the first guest on this podcast to actually call it X.
Well, I was gonna say Twitter, and then I was like, I guess it's been long enough now. I can't pretend any longer. That's sort of why I'm transitioning away. But I'm trying to do more on Instagram. And honestly, Substack is kind of becoming my alternate Twitter because they have like I don't know if you do Substack, but
I might
they
have
have
to.
like a
It's starting to sound really appealing.
yeah, they do. I mean, you don't have to do a newsletter. You can just be on there and they have like a feed, it's like a Twitter feed, where you can, just post little things on there. And I've just started, I had to scroll on something. So I've started scrolling on Substack instead of on Twitter/X. So anyway, but yeah, so that's where you can find me. And yeah, it's been very fun to talk about ghost stories. I was really excited, Daniel, when you invited me to talk about ghost
Yeah,
stories.
I was happy to have you. You've been fantastic. And maybe we'll see you again. We'll see.
Yeah, yeah, let me know.
Yeah.
So, all
Until then,
right.
goodbye.
All right. Bye. Thank you.